Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. I've asked for extra assistance because somebody told me yesterday to break a leg, but it turns out I broke my hand. I know. It's nice to get their empathy before we begin. So those of you who know me know that I'm a wonderful person, right? So as a good person, I'm especially thrilled to live in a world in which good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. So about a month ago, I was driving to work down the highway, and I got stuck behind somebody in the leftmost lane, in the passing lane. And I waited for a while for them to move, but they didn't. Thinking, why? They're probably just an imbecile. Right? They're either ignorant of traffic law or they're willfully ignoring it. So, I actually flashed my lights as well to indicate to them that they need to get out of the way, but they didn't. And so eventually I switched lanes, overtook them, carried on, end of story. But the same day, on my way home from work, I encountered a different kind of problem. In this case, in my rearview mirror, I could see a car approaching at great speed. And you know the type. It's speeding, it's changing lanes, and sure enough, he ended up right behind me. He even had the gall to flash his lights at me, even though I was already traveling over the speed limit. You see the problem here? The problem is I'm almost always the hero of my own story. Right? And like most of you, I'm always, at the end of the day, I need to look at myself and think I'm a good person. But I'm going to suggest that this urge that we have to nurse and protect our self-esteem, it breeds a rather self-righteous form of hypocrisy. So for example, I can think to myself, I assume that I'm a better than average driver, although intellectually I know that the typical person believes that they're a better driver than about 70% of the population, which is mathematically not possible. But I can also take credit for my successes and blame other people or the situation for my failures. So when I land a job that I applied for, I think, oh, my natural gifts, my abilities just shone through. But if I don't, I can blame institutional politics. When the Canucks or the Whitecaps win, they're doing well, I think we won, we. And when they don't, I can think they lost. Right? So a famous psychologist once said that even if you're basking in someone else's reflected glory, you still get a tan. And I think you see this same strange sense of hypocrisy all around you. You see it in those who decry the impact of foreign influence and foreign investment on Vancouver's property values, while staunchly defending their own right to sell their Vancouver rancho for $2 million. You see it in those who deny a new immigrant a job because they lack Canadian work experience. You see it especially in the comments. When a woman is sexually assaulted, you know those vile comments, those questions that people ask. What was she doing at that place at that time, wearing that? But those comments are revealing. The assumption over here again is this wonderful, convenient lie. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Clearly what happened to her was a bad thing. Therefore, she must be a bad person. Of course, the other side of this is, I'm a good person, so such a thing could never happen to me. It's a wonderful self-protective function over here. So all of this is interesting, but this notion that the world is a just place, I think, is especially attractive. It's seductive if you hold privilege in society. And that's a bit like offering somebody a knife. It's a wonderful tool. It works really well for you and me. But when you hand it to somebody else, you're asking them to grasp it from the serrated blade. And it's not entirely your fault because you've only ever held it from the handle. So you don't realize that the very same structure can make others bleed. But talking about privilege, I know, makes people uncomfortable. It makes people feel like we're saying they're not deserving, or worse, that they have no struggles, which is very, very far from the truth. So let me describe it in very different ways, because I too struggle to acknowledge, to identify my own privilege as a male. So let's imagine that life were a video game and that I had the ability to choose the setting of difficulty I'm playing it at. As a visible minority, I'm playing at a moderate level of difficulty. But if in addition to being a visible minority, if I was also a woman, that would be harder still. And if I also identified as queer, that's a pretty hardcore setting of difficulty. Intersectionality means that these layers are multiplicative, they're not additive. But what if I wanted to play the game at the easiest possible setting, where you start with a generous amount of points, where you have several extra lives in case you fail at something and you want to do it over? I think we all know that in this society, I'm talking about the setting of the straight, white, cis male. But again, this is uncomfortable, isn't it? And there is a reason why I chose to make this t-shirt and wear this today. So let's talk about it. Black lives matter, at least they should. They don't as much as they should, which is why this is necessary to say. But with Black Lives Matter, I think we also see in 2016, system justification comes with its own hashtags. One of them is not all men, the other is all lives matter. And of course, it's hard to argue with that. What sensible person would argue that all lives don't matter? But the whole point is that they don't. They don't right now, and that's why it's necessary. That's the whole point. Thank you. But let me give you an example. One of my neighbors is black. Imagine for a moment that his house is on fire. He calls the fire department, they show up, they make sure the residents have been evacuated, and they begin to try to extinguish the fire. Now, I live on the other end of the street. My house is not on fire. But imagine the ridiculousness of this. If I stride out into the middle of the street and I start arguing with the firefighters, insisting that they don't spend so much energy and focus on the house that's engulfed in flames, that they instead come and hose down my home, and not just my home, but every house in the neighborhood. And not just every house in the neighborhood, but every house in the city, because after all houses matter. The trouble is that when we try to talk about inequality, I think we often focus on equal treatment today, while systematically ignoring the inequality that has characterized every moment until now. And so we end up, when you treat people equally, with an undesirable outcome. And you may have seen this image circulating. There's different versions of it, and it tries to depict this same notion of privilege and fairness. But I'd just like to point out that all of the three people in the foreground of this image, none of them are especially privileged. All of them are brown, actually, in this particular illustration. But to be privileged would be having a seat in the stands. These three individuals are not even in the ballpark of privilege. But why am I talking about all of this? Right? I'm supposed to be talking about the psychology of genocide, about the psychology of good and evil, what it takes for an ordinary, average person like you and me to evolve into a mass murderer. Also what it takes for an ordinary, average person like you or I to decide to risk our life and save that of a complete stranger. I'm supposed to be talking about that. But there's two reasons I decided to talk about privilege first. One is I think it felt like a bit of an abdication of my responsibility and really an abuse of the privilege of being a speaker at this extraordinary event, at this amazing festival, if I didn't touch on the events of the last few weeks. But the other part of this is when you try to understand extraordinary evil, one has to appreciate that it's often built on a very ordinary foundation. If you're trying to understand the forces that lead to the formation of a hurricane, you have to understand how normal air currents work. So let's talk about evil. It's a strange term to use. People use it differently. People are uncomfortable using it. It's amorphous. How do you define it? Do you define actions as evil, regardless of intent? Do you focus on intent? That if there's deliberate, with foreseeable consequences, foreseeable harm, that's evil. And are you even comfortable applying the term to describe individuals? This person is evil. Evil means different things. But just like we like the fairy tale that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, we really like the convenient lie that evil is perpetrated by monsters. We like to assume this, but when we do this, we're doing ourselves a disservice. One disservice is that we don't have to explain it. We don't have to understand it. Why did this person do what they did? Well, they're evil. All right, that's the explanation. So we don't have to understand it, which takes away our only shot at preventing it. But beyond that, it's far more terrifying, I would suggest, to acknowledge the reality, which is that the overwhelming majority of actions that could be regarded as evil are perpetrated by perfectly ordinary people. The only thing extraordinary about evil are the actions themselves. It's not the individuals. It's not the perpetrators. Think for a moment about how readily, how quickly, how naturally we classify people in the world around us, usually on the basis of very salient, visible characteristics. And once we classify, we start to identify, often very strongly, with certain groups. And once you identify, of course, then you start to compare your group against other groups, us versus them. And us is, of course, good people. Them are other people. In the context of mass violence, though, there's often a third category that emerges. There's a reason why, in the build-up to the Holocaust, the Nazis described Jews as rats, as bacilli, as bacteria, as vermin. During the 1994 Rwandan genocide, the Hutus described Tutsis as cockroaches because doing this, demonizing, dehumanizing the targeted group moves them outside of your moral universe, where the same rules don't apply, where empathy does not get activated. And these processes don't unfold overnight, of course. They happen gradually. I think most people understand that behavior flows as a reflection of attitudes. But what most people don't appreciate is that attitudes get dragged along with behavior as well. And so the choices that we make determine very much the range of options that are available to us in the next set of choices. Nobody wakes up one day and becomes a mass murderer. It's an evolution. Nobody wakes up one day and decides to be Mother Teresa. That's an evolution. And these are continua of destruction or benevolence, either way. There's a curious thing I've encountered. When I study interviews of people who've perpetrated mass violence and they're interrogated about why they did what they did, the most common response are 4 words. I had no choice. And that's extraordinary. And they're often pointing to the forces of history or consequences they would suffer if they felt they didn't do what they had to do. I had no choice. But what's especially startling to me is that when you study interviews with people like Paul Rusesabagina, Oskar Schindler, people who've risked their lives to save others in dire, frightening circumstances, they too say the same thing. Why did you do what you did? I had no choice. Choice is a funny thing. We often underestimate the power of it. So let me finish with a brief story that illustrates the power, the radical power of choice. One of my dear friends is a child survivor of the Holocaust from Hungary. His aunt and uncle were musicians at the time that the Nazis invaded Hungary. They happened to be traveling in Turkey, so they knew they couldn't go back. So they decided to find where else they could go in the world, and they decided India, of all places. But to get from Turkey to India, of course, they had to cross over land and they had to cross over China. China at the time was occupied by Japan, so they had to go. These Hungarian musicians in Turkey had to go to the Japanese consulate in Ankara to request a transit visa to go to India. It's a little bizarre. And the Japanese consul said, I'm sorry, I understand your plight, I understand the consequences, but I've been forbidden to assist people moving into enemy territory. Enemy territory? Of course, India was occupied by the British. So these Hungarian musicians in Turkey at the Japanese consulate trying to cross over China were denied permission because they were trying to get to British-occupied India. But then the consulate official said, however, if I was going to issue you with a transit visa, here is the stamp that I would place in your passport. And excuse me, I need to go to the washroom for 10 minutes. My friend's uncle reached over, grabbed the stamp, stamped their passports. They made it. They survived. The amazing paradox of social psychology, my discipline, is this. We often look at how powerful social forces are, how easily individual behavior is shaped and influenced by group dynamics, by conformity, by various things going on around you. But the paradox is this. The individual often has the radical potential to alter the situation for everyone. So whether it's system justification, whether it's responding to an argument by saying, not all men or all lives matter, understand this. It's not just the range of choices now. It's what follows next. And it's defining the situation for everybody else. Thank you.